In today's tutorial, we are going to cover Dreamcast emulation totally within Retroarch. I know I have covered Dreamcast emulation in the past, but in that we are looking at 4 separate Dreamcast emulators, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, but thanks to the efforts of Flyinghead and his fork of Reicast named Flycast, most of those strengths are all within Retroarch now, including the ability to play Windows CE games and free upscaling. So let's dig in. The first thing we're going to need is Retroarch if you don't happen to already have it. So head on over to retroarch.com, click on download, scroll all the way down to the very bottom and click on nightly builds. From here you're going to click on Windows, x86 64, and then you're going to scroll all the way down to the very bottom of this list and click on retroarch.7zip. If for whatever reason you get this extracted and you try to launch Retroarch and it doesn't work, scroll back up here to the redistributable.7zip, download that and install it, and you should be good to go. Once you have that downloaded, go ahead and get it extracted. So I just do things on my desktop for demonstration purposes, but just make sure you get this extracted where you want to keep it, because Retroarch will default all of its directories into itself. So if you move it later, you're going to have to delete the config file or manually reset all of the default directories. So just place it where you want it the first time and avoid the headache entirely. Now there are a couple of extra files we need for Dreamcast emulation. We need this dc_boot.bin and dc_flash.bin file. You can dump these easily using a real Dreamcast with a Dream Shell and SD card adapter. That's what I did. That's how I got these. I was planning on doing a video on how to do this, but I have misplaced my SD card adapter. So until another one comes in, I cannot show you how to do this, but it's pretty simple using Dream Shell. So you're going to need both of those. And then, of course, you are going to need some Dreamcast games. These are all games I ripped from my Dreamcast using Dream Shell. Again, I would love to show you this method, but I need to wait for that new SD card to come in, so keep an eye out for a future video where I will show you how to back up your own Dreamcast games. But anyways, once Retroarch is extracted, go ahead and get that sucker opened up. Scroll on down here to retroarch.exe. And we are greeted with the Retroarch main menu. It looks so nice. If you happen to have a controller, you can get that plugged in and you can navigate the menu using a controller, or you can use a keyboard. For today, we are going to be using the keyboard until we start getting into gameplay. So the first thing we need to do in here is get our Dreamcast Core downloaded. So we're going to go over to Online Updater, Core Updater. We're going to press right on the keyboard to scroll down to Sega, and we're going to select Sega-Dreamcast/Naomi Flycast Windows CE. Now, this is the version we want to pick because it is the one that has compatibility with Windows CE games, which is really what makes this super appealing. An all-in-one emulator with upscaling that is free, so yay. Compatibility isn't perfect, but as far as Dreamcast emulators go, this is probably the best all-in-one solution now. But anyway, once that is downloaded, go ahead and back out to the main menu, scroll up one to this Show Desktop Menu button. This brings us to Retroarch's desktop menu, and honestly, this menu is your best friend when trying to get Core set up on Retroarch, because you can make playlists, you can make sure that your required files are in the right place and they're being detected. So the first thing we are going to do is set up a new playlist for Dreamcast games. So right click, new playlist, and we are going to name it Sega _space Dreamcast. Now we need to get games added to this playlist. So I went ahead and selected it, and now we're going to right click and add folder. So my Dreamcast games are on the desktop, so I'm going to go ahead and select this DC games folder I made earlier. When it asks what core it's for Flycast Windows CE, and for the database, this is Dreamcast. And now we just click on OK. So Dreamcast games can come in a variety of different formats. If you rip them yourself, you're going to end up with a GDI format game, and that's why you see multiple tracks here for Resident Evil 3 or Starlancer. I typically tend to convert my .gdis into .chds, which is what the rest of my games are in. I'll cover how to convert your GDI games into CHD at a later time when I do the game ripping tutorial. But as far as our playlist is concerned, we don't need all of these extra tracks, but because I had these in their own folder, it just selects them all. So you can just go ahead and remove these extra track entries if you happen to have them. And then I like to get rid of the region code as well, because I usually only do US games, so I don't need to know which region they are from. But anyway, now that the playlist is set up, we can see over here on the right that there are a lot of red file names. These are all the files that we need to run different games for Dreamcast and Naomi. Now, I don't own any Naomi games, so I don't have a way of getting a Naomi BIOS or ROM files, so I'm not going to cover Naomi per se. Like, the setup is the same. If you want to be able to play Naomi games, you just get these optional files to add into Retroarch. But let's go ahead and get this set up so we can start playing games. So let's go ahead and click back on the Retroarch folder. Scroll back up until you find the system folder. For Dreamcast, files need to be placed in a folder titled DC. So just create a new folder, DC, enter. Go ahead and get in there, and then you can copy the DC boot.bin and DC flash.bin directly into there. And now when we go back to the Retroarch desktop menu and click on a different Dreamcast game, we can see those files have now been properly detected, and we are ready to start playing games. But I'm going to go ahead and close out of Retroarch real quick, just so we can actually see that awesome playlist in the Retroarch main menu itself. So now when we hit left on the keyboard, we can see this awesome Dreamcast controller and all of our Dreamcast games that we have previously set up. Now let's go ahead and make sure everything is working just as it is supposed to. I'm going to go ahead and load up some Marvel vs. Capcom. And it's booting up like we expect, but we're going to go ahead and full screen this now. Just press F on the keyboard.
Web swing.
Spider-Man.
One for JJ.
Now again, the biggest benefit of using Flycast is that it is able to run Windows CE games. Before, the only other emulator that has been capable of running Windows CE games has been Demule, but it didn't let you upscale, so it hasn't always been the greatest thing in the world. Thanks to Flyinghead and his work on this fork of Reicast, that is where you get Flycast from. Isn't that great? I love it. But thanks to his effort, his work, we are now able to play Windows CE games within Retroarch and have access to all of the awesome upscaling.
Wave defeated. Timer awarded. Next wave jumping in.
As you can see, Windows CE games run pretty dang good. At least Starlancer does. I have 2 Windows CE games, Starlancer and Bust-A-Move 4, and both have worked flawlessly, so I need to get more Windows CE games to really put this through its paces, but the fact that I can now play both of those on my PC within Retroarch is pretty cool. But now let's talk about multi-disc Dreamcast games. There were a few of them, so let's go ahead and cover that. If we go back over to our main menu here and click on Show Desktop Menu again, I'm going to click on the Sega Dreamcast playlist. I'm going to close this real quick. So what I'm going to do is now add Shenmue to my playlist. I didn't have it in my DC Games folder intentionally, so now we're going to put it in here. Now I'm going to open up my Shenmue folder, and I'm going to create a new text document. And I'm just going to name it Shenmue. And now I'm going to open that text document, and I am going to write down all 4 of these file names. You can easily do this just by copy pasting the whole thing, or if you just want to type them all in manually, whatever you prefer. So I am going to do it just like that. Now we are going to save this file and close out of there. Now we are going to rename the extension of this file to M3U. Yes, I'm sure we want to change the name of it. Alright, so now back to the Retroarch desktop menu. Right-click in here, add files. We're going to go back over to our desktop, DC games. We're going to go into the Shenmue folder and add the Shenmue M3U file. So this is once again for Flycast. It's a Dreamcast game. Click OK. And now we have a Shenmue playlist. So we're going to go ahead and exit out of Retroarch again to refresh that playlist. Left click, and we can see it now on our Retroarch main menu. So we are going to go ahead and click on that to open it up. Click on Run. Press F to go full screen. I like how that breaks the animation. Good stuff. And it booted straight into Disc 1 of Shenmue. So let's say you're playing through your game and you want to figure out how to change discs when the time comes now that you have this awesome playlist made. You're going to go ahead and scroll on down to Disc Control. You're going to cycle the disc tray status. So you're going to press A or Enter on this. It's going to eject the virtual disc tray. Now you can change your discs to anything that you have in that playlist. So let's just go ahead and change to disc 2, and now we're going to close the virtual disc tray. Now we're going to go ahead and restart the game just so you can see that it's booting straight into disc 2 instead. Now when we click on New Game, it should be asking us to switch over to disc 1. So that covers how to get nearly all of your Dreamcast games up and running in Retroarch. If that is all you care about, congratulations. That is all you really need to watch. You can now play your games, and you have a nice playlist to play them in. Now, if you are interested in prettying this up or seeing any of Flycast's options, go ahead and stick around because there's going to be a lot more to see. Alright, so now that we have this playlist and we can play all of our games, let's go ahead and pretty this sucker up. So the first thing we're going to do is go back over to the main menu, go over to Online Updater. We are going to go over to Playlist Thumbnails Updater. And we're going to click on Sega Dreamcast. Now your games need to be named very specifically for this Thumbnails Updater to work, so I'm going to show you how in mine it doesn't really do anything since I name my games how I like them to look and not according to any good sets or redump information. So that's typically what these are looking for. So in that instance, you're going to go ahead and go back into the Retroarch desktop menu. Click on Sega Dreamcast. Now, Retroarch used to download a huge thumbnail pack for every single game of that system, but it doesn't seem to be an option anymore, sadly, so you kind of need to go around and find which images you want to use individually at this point. So I'm just going to demo with Shenmue. So I'm going to select Shenmue, and I'm going to drag my image into the box art section. And now, whenever I click on Shenmue in Retroarch or in this desktop menu, there will be the new box art. And that box art will actually be saved to your thumbnails folder under Sega Dreamcast named box art. So you can go ahead and delete your original after that point. But now when we go into Retroarch and we scroll down to Shenmue, we can see our lovely new box art. But now let's go ahead and cover some of the core options that are included with Flycast. So go ahead and go to your menu, click on Options, and we can see that there's the normal Create Game Options file. We don't really need to worry about that unless there's a specific setting for any particular game you want to have automatically load. And that can be useful for Dreamcast emulation because if you have Unreal Tournament It will not boot unless you have the cable type set to VGA parentheses RGB. And there are also games that won't boot if you have this set to VGA RGB. The game will detect that you're trying to use a VGA cable and say it cannot be booted with that cable and make you restart it with a TV cable instead. So that is when these create game options files can really come in handy. So for my Unreal Tournament, I have that defaulted to VGA, and I set that in the game options file. Next up is the CPU mode. Typically there is a dynamic recompiler and a software recompiler, but for us, there only seems to be dynamic right now, which is fine because that's what you want to use, because that's what gives you your speed. If for whatever reason you want to get to the Dreamcast dashboard, you just go ahead and click on Boot to BIOS, enable it, and then you can restart Flycast and it'll take you to the Dreamcast dashboard, which is good if you want to set the clock or work on any of your VMU saves. And once you're done, just go ahead and disable it. Next up is our system type. Just go ahead and leave this set to auto. It should work for a vast majority of things, but if for whatever reason it doesn't, you can go ahead and select if you're using a Dreamcast, Naomi, a Thomas Wave. I haven't had any trouble using auto, but I mean, at the same time, I've only really run Dreamcast games, so mileage may vary on that one. You might have to manually select Naomi. Next up is the accumulation pixel buffer size. Now this guy uses your GPU's VRAM and can help games look correct at higher resolutions. So if you have a more modern video card, you are going to have between 2 to 4 gigs on the low side, up to 6, 8, 12 on the high end. So the sizes available are 512, 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabyte. So I go ahead and use 2 gigabytes since I have a 980 Ti. I have 6 available gigabytes of VRAM. So I go ahead and use 2 gigabytes. You can set this to suit your particular needs. If you're upscaling, you can see what effect it might have on each individual game. Next up is the internal resolution, and this lets us scale the games up to be nice, pretty HD. Dreamcast can output 480i, 480p, and 240p depending on the game, so we can just go ahead and crank this sucker up to resolutions well beyond 4K. Of course, anything this high is going to be a huge strain on your GPU. I don't really think going this high is quite necessary, but you know, your mileage may vary, who knows? I have no idea what you're going to do with that. But for me, I'm going to go ahead and select 1440 by 1080. And once you change your internal resolution, it does require a game restart. Games look much nicer once they're being displayed at much higher resolutions, especially on 3D games like Episode 1 Racer here. They just look really nice when you can have these much sharper, cleaner images. But moving on, our next core option is screen orientation. So some games will actually let you rotate your TV to present an arcade style presentation. So if you have a game that does that, you can do that within Retroarch. Moving on to alpha sorting, this is actually an accuracy option. So per triangle sorting is what most Dreamcast emulators do. It's fairly accurate. It does lead to some graphical glitches. So in that instance, you can actually change it over to per pixel. That way you get a very accurate readout of Dreamcast graphics at the cost of performance. If you have a higher end rig, you don't really need to worry about this as much. You should be fine. You can also use this as a speed hack and do per strip, which will let you run this on a lower end system at the expense of accurate graphics. So you might see more glitches, something might not appear right. Go ahead and mess around with those, see what you think. But for the most part, I just leave mine on accurate because I have my overclocked i7 7700K and my 980 Ti, and it can pretty much handle anything I've thrown at it up to this point. Again, mileage may vary. I'd love to hear from you guys on which games give you trouble in terms of performance with per pixel alpha sorting. I'd love to try them out myself if I happen to own the game. Next up, we have the GD-ROM fast loading. So this basically eliminates all GD-ROM loading in Dreamcast games. It can lead to glitches and crashes in my experience, so I typically tend to leave it off, but there are games where it works as advertised, absolutely no loading times, and is pretty friggin' awesome. So go ahead and give it a shot, see if it works for your particular game that you want to use, and decide from there. Next up is Mipmapping. This is another accuracy option here. Mipmapping allowed different size textures to be stored to memory, so that way the further you were from an object, a lower res texture could be in place, and objects you were closer to could have higher resolution textures. Honestly, just leave this one enabled because I don't think it really provides a benefit to turn it off, so just leave that one on. Volume modifier is another graphical option. It adjusts how shadows look, so if you want your shadows to be correct, leave it on. If you want to experiment and see if it provides a performance boost, you can go ahead and turn it off. Widescreen Hack does pretty much what it sounds like. It hacks your games to output into a 16:9 format. Now, sometimes these hacks work really great, sometimes they don't work so great at all and have a ton of object culling on the sides of the screens where things weren't meant to be seen. A lot of these Gen 6 retro communities have actually been working on their own widescreen codes that you can actually implement directly into games, either through an action replay, Game Shark, or by modifying the disk image. So that is honestly my preferred route, but if you want to experiment, it's pretty cool to see, so check this out. I'm going to go ahead and cut to this same scene, but restarted. So honestly, with Episode 1 Racer, the widescreen hack just seems to stretch it out to 16:9. It doesn't really appear to add anything to the overall image. But for the most part, I just typically tend to leave this one off. Again, if I'm going to do something in widescreen, I'm going to find one of those actual game-specific patches to implement widescreen properly. Next up is cable type. Just like I was saying at the beginning of this segment, there is a number of different cables that you can make the Dreamcast think is plugged in. For Unreal Tournament, it does require VGA. For some games, it'll require the TV. For the most part, I just leave this one on TV RGB because in emulation, I don't really see a difference personally between the TV and the VGA output. Like on a real console, VGA box all the way, but in emulation, I can't see the difference. Next up is broadcast, and this determines what type of TV the Dreamcast thinks it's hooked up to, whether NTSC, PAL, PAL-M, PAL-N. For the most part, I don't really think you need to set this manually. I've left mine on default and it's worked fine, but again, I'm just using NTSC only games. So if you're using PAL region games, you might need to manually set something. I just haven't ever had to deal with that. Check it out. If you run into something that isn't working right, try changing your broadcast region. Moving on to frame rate, just go ahead and leave this on full speed. It is actually a back-end option that affects the way the emulator runs in the background. So leave this on full speed. Normal can cause trouble with certain things, so just leave it on full speed. Don't really mess with it. Next up is our console region, so you can set this to be Japanese, USA, Europe. I leave mine on default. Again, I only use USA games, so I haven't had any issues with this or needed to set it manually, but I'm sure there is some random case out there where default just doesn't work and you have to manually select what type of system you're using. Next up is Div Matching. This can relate to how graphics are displayed. It results in a less accurate presentation, but it can fix certain games, especially from what I've seen over on the Naomi side. So if there are some really interesting glitches you're coming across, go ahead and try experimenting with this, but honestly, just leave it off otherwise. Next up are a couple of controller options. You can set your dead zones for both the analog stick and triggers. I just leave those on default. I haven't really had any problems with my 8BitDo SF30 Pro. Next up is digital triggers. If you want to get rid of the analog range on a typical Dreamcast controller, you can go ahead and enable this. There will just be on and off. Next is the gun crosshair displays. If you're playing a light gun game, you can enable these, so that way you can change how your reticle will appear on screen. Next up is sound processing. Leave this on unless you really don't want sound in any of your Dreamcast games. Next up is texture upscaling using the XBRZ method. So this can really smooth out 2D images and provide a pretty decent looking upscale if you're into this sort of thing. So this is combined with the texture upscaling filtered size. So in Marvel vs. Capcom, if I leave this at the default 256, the upscaling doesn't really seem to do anything. But if I increase the size of this filtering, we can see that all of the 2D images have been smoothed out. So I know a lot of people prefer this. I personally prefer the sharp pixel look that is provided without it. So this one will be a personal preference. If you want to use it, go ahead and experiment. As for me, I just prefer sharp pixels, especially on 2D games. Next up is enable render to texture. You want to go ahead and leave this on. It fixes games like Crazy Taxi. And then we can also enable a buffer to store those textures. For this guy, I usually tend to leave it off. Next up is the render to texture upscaling, and this is great for games that render to texture to output any screen objects. So for my example, we are going to be using Crazy Taxi. So if you look at the pause menu here in Crazy Taxi, it looks really pixelated despite being upscaled to 1080p. So if I unpause the game, it looks fine. It looks exactly like you would expect, but once you pause it, you can see all of that original resolution assets shining through. Now, if we go back into the menu and upscale this texture, now when I pause the game, it looks a lot smoother, it looks a lot better. Unfortunately, if I go above 2x upscaling on this, the game will actually start breaking graphics, so check this out. It looks awesome, it looks smooth, but unfortunately, that is not what the pause menu is supposed to look like. And it just gets worse from there the further up we go. So for the most part, I typically just leave this at 2 times upscaling. I think that is a good balance between broken graphics and smoothed out graphics. Next up is threaded rendering. Go ahead and leave this one on. It provides a good speed boost for most computers. Next up is synchronous rendering, and this can help with frame pacing. When it is off, the emulator will drop a frame every so often, and if you turn it on, it will pause the video emulation, resulting in a much smoother performance. So I prefer to leave this one on, but it can cause some performance hits, so just adjust it accordingly. If you are susceptible to frame pacing, definitely try turning it on, see what you think, but for the most part, I think everyone should be fine leaving it off. Next up is frame skipping. You can turn this on if you can't run a game at full speed. You can try skipping a couple frames to make it a little more playable. If you don't have problems with that, just leave it off because it results in some janky imaging. Next up is the Puru Puru pack, and this is your Rumble emulation. So if you want Rumble emulation, go ahead and leave that on. If you don't, turn it off. Next up is the Allow Naomi service buttons. This is specifically for Naomi emulation. It lets you do some hardware stuff that I am not familiar with. I don't do Naomi stuff, so I've never actually messed with this. So next up is Load Custom Textures. This is if there is a high-res texture pack that you want to load into your emulator. I don't have any experience doing this with Dreamcast. I've done this on GameCube a ton. It looks awesome. And this coincides with our next option, which is to dump textures. So if you want to make custom textures for any Dreamcast game, you can tick this on and it will start dumping every texture that appears on screen that you can then go in and edit into a high-res texture pack that you can use with Load Custom Textures. The remainder of our options are all for the VMU, which is how Dreamcast saves games. So if you want to have shared VMUs across all of your Dreamcast games, you can just leave this per game VMU option off. Or if you would like to have a new VMU for every single Dreamcast game, you can turn it on. And you can set if this is going to be just the first VMU or if it's going to be every single VMU for all controller slots. For me, I like to leave this on VMU 1. That way you will always have a fresh memory card for every game you start playing. That way you don't have to worry about if you are going to run out of save space. And if you want, you can still have other optional saves set to your other VMUs. Flycast makes 4 VMU saves, so if there is something that you would like to have shared between games, you can always set those saves to a different VMU in the Dreamcast dashboard, as we covered earlier. The remainder of our options are all for on-screen VMU displays, and I am so glad this finally got implemented into Flycast. You can tick this on, and now we have a VMU display up in the top left of our screen. You can change where this will display, but I like to leave them according to split-screen controller options, so player 1's will be in the upper left, I like to change player 2's to the upper right, and so on and so forth. Now that VMU is pretty tiny up there, so you can actually make that a little bit bigger if you'd like, but do beware, they are overlaying it with the game. Sadly, it doesn't go into the black bordered area, So be sure you are aware of that when you're setting your scale, that you're not covering up anything that might be important to the game. Our next options are to determine what colors our VMU will have. By default, it has it set to what the actual VMU looks like, but if you want to change things up a little bit, you can actually make this look pretty interesting by changing the background colors. Go ahead and mess around with that, see what you think, see if there's any really interesting color combinations you really prefer. For me, I just kind of leave this default. It's what I'm used to. I don't really need to screw with my head when I go back to my real Dreamcast. Our last VMU option is for screen opacity. Now, I believe this is supposed to make it so your on-screen VMU will actually be a little transparent so you can see the game underneath it. But no matter what option I choose here, the image doesn't change. So I don't think it is currently working as of the time I've made this video. So that does it for core options. There are a few more things we can mess around with when it comes to Dreamcast emulation though. Like which controllers we can have set up to be playing games with. By default, it is just the standard Dreamcast controller, but if you want to use an arcade stick, you can have that set up. Or if you want to even use the Dreamcast keyboard, this does work completely. Now, if you do want to use a keyboard in Dreamcast games that supported it, I do recommend backing out to the Retroarch main menu here and going to Input, going down to the hotkey binds and pressing delete on every single hotkey, because if you're using a Dreamcast keyboard and you press any of these keys, you might get an unwanted result. Say you're playing Unreal Tournament and you're trying to jump with space, all of a sudden the emulator is in fast forward. Just make sure if you do delete your menu toggle button, just make sure you have a button key to it on your controller so you can get back into the menu at any point. But after you've done that, you are all set to play games with a Dreamcast keyboard using your PC keyboard. There's also a listing here to use a mouse as a controller, but I have not been able to get this to work. I've been trying it on Quake 3, Unreal Tournament, and no matter what I try, I can't get my mouse to actually register as an input method yet. I don't think it is currently supported, unfortunately, but soon, since they have an option, I'm hoping it'll come soon. One thing you can use your computer mouse for is actually light gun emulation, so that's what those light gun cursor options were for earlier. They let you decide what color your mouse cursor is for light gun games. The last two controllers are for twin sticks, either the Sega Saturn or a Dreamcast twin stick, I believe. I've never owned a twin stick, so I've never actually tried these out. I don't know what games really supported it, but they are an available controller option. For the most part, though, I think everyone will be fine just leaving this on controller. And if you do want to remap any of your buttons, you can go ahead and map them here. So the last thing I'm going to touch on is, of course, shaders. They have a new option in here for you to enable and disable shaders very easily, rather than having to go in and delete shaders you had previously set up. If you want to use shaders, go ahead and tick this on and go down to load shader preset. For me, I am always going to be a fan of CRT easy mode. I love the image this provides. It's very reminiscent of my Sony Trinitron or my 16:9 ViewSonic computer monitor. I really like the way this looks. It is a lot cleaner than most displays were back in the day that people would play Dreamcast on. So if you want to see something a little more authentic, you can go back into the CRT menu and you can load up CRT Royal. And this makes it look a little more appropriate for the era. Of course, shaders are all based on personal preference, so there are a ton of them, so go through, figure out which ones you like, and set it up accordingly. For me, it's always going to be easy mode. I just love the crisp RGB style scan lines, and I just think it looks very clean, very neat. Anyways, once you have your shader options set up, go ahead and save them as a core preset. And if you have all of your other emulation settings how you like them, go ahead and save that as a core override as well. This will make it anytime you load up a Dreamcast game, everything you have set up will now be set up for every single game that you load in Flycast, and this is very, very helpful. And there we have it, Dreamcast emulation completely within Retroarch. Thank you all so much for watching these tutorials. If you have any questions, as always, leave them in the comment section down below. And be sure to check out some of the other tutorials on the channel as well. And if there happens to be other content you might be interested in, there's tons of that also, including reviews and even a Rogue Squadron walkthrough. So, lots of cool stuff here. Please check it out. And as always, thank you so much again for watching. Have a good one.